Detroit did not care whether Amara Johnson was tired. The city moved the same way it always did, indifferent to grief, indifferent to the fact that a 28-year-old woman had buried her mother only 4 months earlier and was still learning how to walk through her own apartment without expecting to hear her mother's voice calling from the kitchen. Amara worked as an architect at a mid-sized firm downtown, talented enough that her designs were used, overlooked enough that her name was rarely the one attached to them. She had grown used to that particular kind of erasure. Her mother, Ruth Johnson, had spent 30 years cleaning office buildings after dark so that her daughter could sit in classrooms during the day, and Amara carried that debt the way some people carry faith, quietly, constantly, in everything she did. The night everything changed began as an obligation rather than an occasion. A colleague had begged off attending a charity gala downtown, the kind of event thrown by a real estate foundation looking to court new donors, and Amara had agreed to go only because the firm needed a warm body in the room and free food was free food. She wore a dress borrowed from her closest friend, Diane Cole, a sharp-tongued attorney who had been telling Amara for months that she needed to leave the apartment, and remember, she was still a person outside of work and mourning. Amara did not expect to be noticed. She stood near the edge of the room with a glass of wine she wasn't drinking, watching wealthy strangers perform friendliness at one another, when a man approached her not because she looked like she belonged there, but because she looked like the only person in the room who wasn't pretending. His name was Richard Whitfield, and he was there because his father's company was one of the foundation's largest donors, a role he had inherited along with the family name and the expectation that came with it. He was handsome in the practiced way of a man who had never had to work at being liked, but there was something in the way he spoke to Amara that felt different from the polish surrounding him. He asked her what she did, and when she said architecture, he asked which buildings, and when she named 2, he admitted he had walked past one of them every day for a year without knowing who designed it. It was a small moment, but it landed somewhere real in her, the simple experience of being seen for her work rather than her presence. They talked for almost 2 hours that night, ignoring the room around them. Richard confessed, with a kind of self-aware embarrassment, that he found the entire world of galas exhausting, that most conversations he had were transactions wearing the costume of friendliness. Amara found herself laughing for the first time in months, a genuine laugh, the kind her mother used to say she could hear from 2 rooms away. When he asked for her number, she gave it to him, telling herself it meant nothing, that men like Richard Whitfield dated women who looked like magazine covers, not architects with unfinished grief and a full-time job holding her own life together. He called 2 days later, then again the following week. Their courtship moved slowly at first. Dinners in quiet restaurants where Richard seemed almost relieved not to be recognized. Walks along the river where he asked more questions about her mother than about his own family's business. Amara noticed, early on, that he rarely brought her around people from his world, and when she asked him about it, he brushed the question aside with a joke about protecting her from boring people. She let it go. She wanted, more than she admitted to herself, for this to be simple. The first real crack in that simplicity came at a dinner 4 months into their relationship, when Richard finally brought her to meet his mother, Eleanor Whitfield, at the family's estate outside the city. Eleanor was polished in a way that made every room feel smaller, a woman who had spent her entire adult life curating appearances, first her husband's, now her son's. She greeted Amara with a smile that did not reach her eyes and a compliment about her dress that felt, somehow, like an inventory rather than a kindness. Over dinner, Eleanor asked Amara pointed questions about her family, her upbringing, her mother's occupation, each one delivered with a gentleness that did not disguise its purpose. By the time dessert was served, Amara understood, without anyone saying it directly, that Eleanor had already decided who she was and where she belonged in her son's future, and it was not at the head of any table Eleanor controlled. Richard apologized in the car afterward, calling his mother difficult, old-fashioned, said in ways that had nothing to do with Amara personally. Amara wanted to believe him. She noticed other things too in those early months, small moments she filed away without fully examining. A valet dented Richard's car outside a restaurant, and for 3 full seconds, Richard's face lost every trace of the warmth Amara had come to associate with him. A flash of cold fury so foreign to the man, she knew that it startled her before he caught himself and laughed it off as nothing. For a while, this was enough. A husband who came home most nights before James was asleep. A mother-in-law who kept her distance more than she interfered. A life that looked, from the outside, exactly like the life Amara had once thought she didn't deserve. But underneath the surface of those 3 years, quietly, patiently, forces were already moving that Amara could not yet see. Arrangements made before she ever entered the family. A legacy tangled around conditions she knew nothing about. And a mother-in-law who had never stopped waiting for the right moment to make sure her son's marriage did not survive. Detroit's winter gave way to a spring that Amara barely noticed, folded as she was into the rhythms of motherhood and a marriage that still felt, most days, like something worth protecting. 3 years had passed since the wedding. James was learning to ride a bicycle in the long driveway of the estate, and Richard's father, a formidable man named Robert Whitfield who had built the company from a single commercial property into an empire spanning 4 states, was dying slowly of a heart condition he had hidden from almost everyone. Robert's death, when it came on a gray morning in early spring, changed the architecture of the entire family overnight. Richard inherited not just the company but the full weight of everything his father had never taught him to carry alone, and Eleanor, who had spent decades as a supporting figure in her husband's shadow, stepped forward into the vacuum with a swiftness that surprised even Richard. She began attending board meetings. She began weighing in on decisions that had nothing to do with her. And she began, in small and deliberate ways, tightening her grip on every part of her son's life, including his marriage. The humiliations started subtly enough that Amara almost convinced herself she was imagining them. A company dinner where the seating chart placed her at the far end of the table, 3 seats from her own husband, while Eleanor sat at his right hand discussing quarterly earnings as though Amara weren't in the room at all. An anniversary gala for the company's 40th year in business, an event Amara had helped plan the previous year, from which she found her name conspicuously absent on the final guest list. An oversight Eleanor apologized for with a smile that suggested no apology was actually intended. At family gatherings, Eleanor had taken to calling James the boy, instead of using his name, a small verbal distancing that Amara noticed long before Richard ever seemed to. When Amara finally raised the pattern with Richard, gently, hoping he would simply talk to his mother, he responded the way he was learning to respond to everything now that he ran the company, as a problem to be managed rather than a wound to be healed. He told Amara that his mother was grieving, that she needed time, that Amara should try not to take it personally, language that sounded almost identical to the language he used with difficult board members. It was the first time Amara noticed that her husband had begun speaking to her the way he spoke to people he was trying to placate rather than people he loved. It was around this time that Victoria Lane joined Whitfield Capital as a junior executive in the acquisitions division, 26 years old, sharp, ambitious, and unafraid to stay in the office long after everyone else had gone home. Richard began working later. He called it the natural demand of stepping into his father's role, and for a while, Amara believed him, because believing him was easier than the alternative, and because a part of her still wanted, badly, for the life she had built to be real. Diane Cole was the only person willing to say aloud what Amara was only beginning to let herself feel. Over coffee one gray afternoon, in the small kitchen of the Detroit apartment Amara still kept, half out of nostalgia and half out of something she couldn't yet name, Diane looked at her oldest friend and asked bluntly whether Amara had noticed how often Richard's assistant scheduled late deal calls, on nights when Victoria Lane also happened to be working late. Amara pushed the question away in the moment, defensive on instinct, but she carried it home with her, and that night, lying awake beside a husband who was already asleep, she let herself wonder for the first time whether the life she had built was as solid as she needed it to be. It was in this same season, quietly, without ceremony, that Amara renewed her independent contractor's license for a second time and reorganized the old architectural portfolio she had never fully abandoned, storing digital copies in a private account Richard didn't know existed. She told herself it meant nothing, that every woman deserves something that belongs only to her. She did not yet understand how much that single decision would come to matter. The discovery, when it finally came, arrived in a manner too small and mundane to belong in the story of a marriage's undoing, and that was precisely what made it so devastating. Amara was gathering Richard's suits for the dry cleaner on an ordinary Tuesday when a folded paper slipped from an inside jacket pocket onto the bedroom floor. It was a hotel receipt from a boutique property in Chicago, dated the same night Richard had told her he was closing a deal with investors from Charlotte. 2 names were listed under the reservation, his and one other, an unfamiliar name that took Amara only a moment to place, because she had seen it before, on an org chart pinned to the wall of Richard's home office. Victoria Lane. Amara did not scream. She did not throw the receipt across the room the way she imagined, in some distant part of her mind, that a different kind of woman might have. She sat down on the edge of the bed she shared with her husband and read the date 3 times, as if repetition might change what it said, and then she folded the paper carefully and placed it in her purse, and she waited for him to come home. The confrontation happened in the study that night, low-voiced, because James was asleep down the hall, and neither of them wanted to be the reason he woke to the sound of his parents' marriage breaking. Amara placed the receipt on the desk between them without a word. Richard looked at it for a long moment, and then, instead of the shame she had braced herself for, something colder crossed his face, something Amara recognized instantly as the same expression he wore when the valet dented his car years earlier, the mask finally slipping all the way off. He did not deny it. He told her, in a voice stripped of any softness she had ever heard from him, that the affair meant nothing, that she was making more of it than it deserved. And then, in the same breath, he reminded her of everything he had given her, the house, the name, the life she would never have had on her own salary as an architect who couldn't get her name on her own designs. It was the first time in their marriage that Richard weaponized his wealth directly against her, using it not as a gift, but as a debt she was now expected to repay with her silence. Amara did not leave that night. She told herself it was because of James, and that was true, but it was not the whole truth. Eleanor made it unmistakably clear, in a private conversation days later that felt more like a corporate negotiation than a family conversation, that any attempt by Amara to leave the marriage publicly would be treated as an attack on the Whitfield name and handled accordingly, with the full resources of the family's legal team. It was in this same conversation that Amara first heard, spoken aloud almost as an afterthought, a reference to the prenuptial agreement she had signed at 24, drafted entirely by Whitfield family lawyers, a document she remembered signing in a blur of wedding preparations and trust she no longer felt was warranted. In the months that followed, Richard grew bolder rather than more careful, as though Amara's silence had given him permission rather than pain. Victoria began appearing at company functions Amara attended, standing just close enough to Richard to make the nature of their relationship an open secret rather than a hidden one. Eleanor, meanwhile, began a quieter campaign of her own, dropping careful remarks among the family's social circle about Amara's state of mind, her moods, her fitness, small seeds of doubt planted months before anyone would understand their purpose. The hardest moment of this period came on an evening Amara would replay in her mind for years afterward. James, then 8 years old, sat across from her at the kitchen table, pushing food around his plate with the particular seriousness only children carry when they've noticed more than adults think they have. He asked her, without warning, whether she and Daddy were going to stop being married, the way his friend Tyler's parents had. Amara looked at her son's face, so much like Richard's in its structure and entirely her own in its watchfulness. And she lied to him for the first time in his life, told him that everything was going to be fine, that grown-ups sometimes had hard days, and watched him decide, with visible effort, to believe her. Diane pressed Amara harder after that, telling her plainly that she needed to protect herself legally before anything else happened, that hope was not a strategy in a marriage already this far gone. Amara hesitated. She kept believing, against a mounting pile of evidence, that if she could simply hold on long enough, for James's sake, the family might still find its way back to something resembling stability. It was this hesitation that Richard exploited next, in the coldest and most calculated maneuver of the marriage so far. Under the guise of what he called simplifying the estate for tax purposes, Richard restructured the ownership of nearly every asset the couple shared, moving properties, accounts, and investments fully into his name alone, framing the entire process to Amara as a routine matter of financial housekeeping that any responsible family handled eventually. Amara, exhausted, distracted by the slow unraveling of her marriage and the daily work of protecting her son from its damage, signed documents she should have read more carefully, trusting a husband who had already shown her, in the study that night with the receipt on the desk, exactly how little that trust was worth. By the time she understood what those documents actually meant, the trap Eleanor and Richard had built around her, patiently, legally, and almost invisibly, was already closed. Something in Amara went still that day, and then, slowly, something else began to move in its place. She thought of the two properties she had redesigned years earlier at that same kitchen table, working after James was asleep, handing her sketches to Richard's team without ever putting her name to the paper. She thought of the independent license she had quietly renewed, year after year, without ever fully understanding why. Diane, reading the same realization on her friend's face, told her plainly that the uncredited architectural work Amara had done on two of Whitfield Capital's flagship properties had never been covered under the prenuptial agreement, because the agreement addressed marital assets, not intellectual property Amara had created independently and never formally signed away. It was Marcus Reyes who gave that discovery its first real shape. Marcus, whose mother Amara's own mother had worked alongside decades earlier cleaning the same downtown offices, had built a modest but respected investment fund of his own, the kind of quiet, patient capital that didn't chase headlines. He remembered Amara's design work from years before Whitfield Capital ever existed in her life, and when Diane brought her friend's situation to him, he didn't see a woman asking for charity. He saw an architect whose eye for value the market had never properly priced, and he offered her something no one else had, a partnership built on what she could build going forward, not on what she had lost. The years that followed were not glamorous in the way the years inside the Whitfield estate had once appeared from the outside. Amara's first solo project was a modest renovation Marcus's fund financed on a tight budget, and she oversaw every detail herself, the way she once had for a company that never let her put her name on the work. Her second project drew attention beyond Detroit. Her third put her name, her actual name, on a building for the first time in her professional life, and something in her healed in a way legal victories alone could never have accomplished. Richard's marriage to Victoria, meanwhile, dissolved with a speed that surprised no one who had watched it form. Victoria had wanted the position Amara once held without ever wanting the coldness that came attached to it, and Richard, it turned out, treated every wife with the same eventual indifference. Eleanor's grip on the company began to slip as the board, watching Richard's judgment falter in one deal after another, lost confidence in a leadership that had spent more energy protecting family control than building the business itself. Amara built her firm over years, not months, a detail she insisted the story never rush past, because the truth of her comeback was that it was earned in the same slow, uncredited way her earlier life inside the marriage had been. There was a night, roughly 5 years after the divorce, when she outbid a competing firm for a major mixed-use development contract, only learning weeks later that the competing bid had come from Whitfield Capital itself. A company that had never once suspected the woman it beat was the same woman it had once discarded. By the time 7 years had passed since the night in the snow, Amara Johnson, no longer a Whitfield in name, controlled a firm with contracts across 3 states and a reputation built entirely on her own work. Marcus's fund, now deeply intertwined with her success, made a quiet, deliberate move that year, acquiring a controlling stake in Whitfield Capital through a series of transactions Richard never saw coming. Because he had never once considered the woman he pushed out of his life capable of becoming a threat. The final meeting between them took place at the same estate where it had all unraveled, though the house itself now answered to different ownership than either of them had grown up expecting. Amara did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She sat across from Richard, a man who looked older than his years in a way money had never managed to disguise, and explained, in the same measured tone he had once used to explain a divorce, the terms of what came next. There was no triumph in her voice, only the quiet certainty of someone stating facts that could no longer be argued with. The truest ending of the story belonged not to Amara and Richard, but to Amara and James, now 15, tall in the way that startled her every time she looked at him, old enough to have quietly watched both of his parents for years and drawn his own conclusions. He came to her on his own, told her plainly that he wanted to live with her, that he had wanted to for a long time and hadn't known how to say it. It was not a line delivered for drama. It was the truth a mother had waited 7 years to hear, and when he said it, something in Amara that had been holding its breath since a December night in the snow finally allowed itself to exhale. The story closes on Amara walking back through the same gates where she had once stood shivering with a single suitcase, this time as the woman whose name now sat quietly, unmistakably, behind the ownership of everything inside them. James walks beside her, not behind her, and there is no security detail waiting to keep her out. The people who mistake someone's quiet strength for weakness rarely understand what they are dealing with until it's far too late to change the outcome. And the coldest lesson Richard and Eleanor Whitfield ever learned was that the woman they threw out into the snow had spent 7 years quietly building the ground they would eventually have to stand on. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that real love shows up in the small, quiet moments, not just the grand ones. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because we have so much more coming your way.